3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But we got there because of our selection by the Air Force Intelligence Service, Air Force Security Service out of Brooksfield, Texas in 1950 we started. We were being selected as a group to start the intelligence services in Europe because of the close down of the military after World War II. Well, in October of 1951, John Cash and a small group of us was selected to go to Landsberg, Germany. And in Landsberg then, I did not know John before that time, but we were selected and placed in the same room. We were very high level intelligence and did not even speak to each other. In our own room, we did not talk about our job. But John was nothing but like me. We were out of northeastern Arkansas, just a few miles apart. He and I both enlisted in the Air Force about the same time. And so we just were kids out of the cotton fields, about 18 years of age, when we arrived in Europe. Now then, none of us had any, well, I shouldn't say none of us. There was a fellow by the name of Orville Rigdon who was an extremely talented guitar individual. John was a unique individual. John started, he would write poetry. He would write little notes on beer coasters. He would, if he heard a little thing, he would write it down for future use, I guess. You'd have to know John, a very talented individual, very good high-speed Morse code intercept operator, as all of us were individually selected for that type of work. Now then, when we arrived in Landsberg, we wore nothing but what we call World War II uniforms. And it wasn't until about sometime in 1952 that we were permitted to wear civilian clothes and go downtown. Prior to that, if you went anywhere, you were in a military uniform. Now then, when we got there, why, you could go anywhere you wanted to on a weekend, or not necessarily a weekend, but when you were off shift. But then, when you came back, you had to go back to this highly classified work that we were doing. And so the city of Landsberg, a very beautiful place. I want to say hi to all the people in Landsberg. You always treated us nice. You live in a very beautiful place. And I have been back to Landsberg with my wife on one occasion. Now then, I'm going to have to say that prior to going to Landsberg, John met a lady in San Antonio, Texas, Vivian Lobreto, I believe is a correct pronunciation of her name. John literally wrote her a letter, or sometimes 2 letters, every day, and she would write back the same way. And if John did not get a letter, he might be a little bit on the unhappy side. But anyway, John told me one day that he was going to get engaged to Vivian. Now then, Vivian was a Catholic. John was a Baptist from northeastern Arkansas. Now then, I spoke to John. I said, John, have you really checked into your religious marriages about whatever the restrictions might be between you and Vivian? Now then, there's been some books wrote about us, and that's where they indicate that I was the person who brought it up to John to check into that, which he started writing letters to Vivian, asking lots of questions. But anyway, he and Vivian got married after John returned to the States, and I might remind everybody, John got married in his Air Force uniform. He was very proud of his duties in the uniform. Now then, later on, I would like to relate a situation about one of maybe 2 of John's recordings or records that he put out. And maybe I'll just go into it right now. Otherwise, I might forget it. Okay. But anyway, in 1937, there was a great flood. The Mississippi River in the United States was not totally controlled, and the floodplain was wide. I lived probably 30 miles from the Mississippi River. John may have lived 20 miles from the Mississippi River. And in that time, why, all the floodwaters would chase all of us, I call it poor people, out of the cotton fields of Arkansas, and we'd be evacuated to highland. Now, John finally wrote a song about that situation. We were, of course, only about 5 years old. But anyway, John wrote How High is the Water, or something of that nature was the title of it. And he wrote about the flood, both his family down in Arkansas and my family, we had to be evacuated from the flood waters of the Mississippi River. Now then, the other song that I want to relate to has to do with something that happened. Earlier I related to the fact that in 1952, when we were permitted to start wearing civilian clothes, our little group of people started getting clothes from wherever we could get them. Most of us had to write back to the States, and some bought German clothes, and so we could start going downtown in civilian clothes, which was quite a change for us, since we were been wearing those same old World War II military uniforms after we had left the base. Well, what really happened is, it's quite funny that we had a man whose name is Claude V. White. He was a black man. He was quite a jivey individual, well-liked man. But anyway, we put on our civilian clothes, and Claude had gone out and bought some of the most beautiful, but maybe you could call it ungodly looking blue suit, along with blue suede shoes, along with a blue hat. And we were all assembled waiting for the bus to come pick us up. But anytime any one of us would get near Claude White, he would yell out and put on a very jivey type move and say, "Stay off my blue suede shoes." Now then, years later, after John became famous, why, John both told me, and I got the same information from Carl Perkins, who was also a very famous songwriter. Now then, that both told me that one day they were jamming in one of the rooms before a performance, and Carl Perkins said to Cash, he said, "I haven't had a hit in a long time. I need a good song that I can get a #1 hit." So Perkins said that John did an imitation of Claude, "Stay off my blue suede shoes," and Carl Perkins went back, they say, into the motel room and wrote a song called "Blue Suede Shoes," which was later covered by Elvis Presley and a number of other people. But Carl Perkins wrote the song, and I think that's quite a story to relate about that one. Both of those, I have lots of things I can talk about, because I used to talk forever on stuff like this. But anyway, I'd like to get back to Landsberg. Landsberg was just a beautiful city. All of us admired the place, and I have not, in all my years, and I'm approaching 84 years of age, heard any one of them say a single thing that was negative toward Landsberg. The people were beautiful to us. A couple, 3 bars in town, the Hotel Goggle, another bar across the street called Zeta Bar, and another one that I can't come up with the name right now, but those are the places we hung out when we were off duty in Landsberg. Back in the 1950s, the transportation for all the military going to all parts of the world was on board troop ships from World War II. And all of us went through the Brooklyn Naval Yards in Brooklyn, New York, where we were placed on board troop ships for Europe. And of course, none of us, I would just practically say, none of us have ever been on a ship before in our life. And it was during the month of October that the weather was bad going across the Atlantic. And most of us would get seasick on board those ships, and we were headed for well, they didn't tell us where we were going, but they went through the English Channel and went into Bremerhaven, Germany, where we were placed on trains that dispatch us through what they call a displacement centers. and I can't recall the name of the beautiful place that they processed us through, but nevertheless, we were there for a few days. A beautiful place. Everybody said, let's stay here, it's beautiful. But then they put us on trains down to Landsberg, and that's where we were received in Landsberg and taken, well, the question was, is how can I relate to John and him in Landsberg? I might relate to this. We were all just young people coming back. Our first time, we had no idea what destiny had in store for us. We were all coming back during bad times in the United States because of jobs were scarce and times were really, really bad. And so I don't think that John or any of the rest of us knew what the future held for us. So John got out of the Air Force and shortly thereafter married Vivian, and they moved to a place near Memphis, Tennessee. Now, I do know that John had a desire to be a famous musician, and so therefore, between him and Orville Rigdon, the guitar man, Orville was always trying to teach John to play a flat-top guitar. The guitar floated around the room. Everybody picked it up and banged on it or whatever they wanted to do with it. And I did not really know who bought the guitar, but I later learned that John paid $5 for the guitar, which was a flat-top guitar from somewhere downtown in Landsberg, I assume. And I think the story like this, we could go down to Garmisch on the weekend, and if you like to ski, you could go skiing up in the mountains and enjoy everything. In fact, I was there when they built the new monument across the bridge. It was a wooden bridge up the lake. They built this beautiful monument there in Landsberg, which still is there. I have some beautiful pictures of it. And I used to go down to the river during the winter months and play the games, ice games down on the river with the Germans that were there, and could pass away a lot of good hours down on the river playing some of the ice games with the local German people. So I had fond memories of Landsberg. Have really fond memories of those 3 bars and everything that we had, because we were quite restricted to what we could do, and we always had to be in by midnight, had to be off the streets and things like that. But anyway, we might talk about things like that. But other than that, why, it's pretty straightforward. Now I'll pick up John coming back to the USA, and he came back to Memphis, Tennessee, after he and Vivian both. Now then, they got married very shortly after John returned to the States. Now, John didn't have a job either, so he went to all kinds of places looking for a job. Now, what would happen there, we'd go from place to place. Do you have a vacancy? We wanted a job. We did not want to return to the poor people's life in the cotton fields of Arkansas. We had already seen the better part of life. We wanted to go forward. Now, I understand that John got a job selling appliances, door to door, I understand, in Memphis, Tennessee. Now then, during this period of time, he also was enrolled in Keegan's School of Broadcasting in Memphis, Tennessee, which I wanted to go there as well. And why we had this in common, I do not know. But I got a job at a radio station in the broadcasting business, and so I got a nice job, and didn't pay anything much, but it was a job. And John and I did not really, well, we stayed in contact, but not close. I visited with him, and I did interview him in Nashville when I was doing celebrity interviews along with all the other celebrities that would be at the National Disc Jockeys Convention, which was held in Nashville. Pick it up there. In leaving Landsberg, all of us would reflect on the good times we had, the beauty of the country just fascinated us, and of course we took some trips mission-wise up into the Bavarian Alps, and would be up there in the snow during the winter months and suffer being in some tents and things like that, and snow and everything. But it was also such a beautiful place to just go and see it. And the question was, can I reflect how we felt on leaving Landsberg and coming back to the States? Of course, most of us arrived there at the same time, and we were returning to the States based upon our termination of our enlistment. And all of us were looking forward to coming back and doing whatever we had to do and look into the future. Now then, of course, Cash and I had not being too far from home, and I was working in broadcasting and kind of kept up with his career, even though I might say that our entertainment director at the radio station did not really like John's music all that well, so therefore the entertainment director, or the program director, would not provide me with some of John's recordings, which I would have liked to have, but he was the boss and I was behind the microphone, so I had very little to say about that. Because he was such a talented individual. I might say that we had some other people that went on to be not exactly famous, but to be musicians and things like that. I will relate this one story. We had one of our people in our room. His last name was James. He never participated in anything, any of the sing-alongs. I know very little about him. But when I was working out of KCHR, the radio station in Charleston, Missouri, I was quite often invited to come introduce an act, or I would go just to sit in a session or something like that at the dancing clubs. The clubs up and down the Mississippi River were quite rowdy, and the circuit up and down there was known as the Bloody Bucket Circuit, of all things. And let me tell you what, everything in this world went on in those nightclubs. But anyway, while my wife and I was sitting in this restaurant, this gentleman came up, tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, "Are you Bill Harrell?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "You remember me?" And I did not remember him. He changed, and of course, I did not remember him till he reintroduced himself. He said, "I'm James from room 85 at Landsberg, Germany." And I said, "Oh, no." Quite embarrassed, but nevertheless, we got to talking, and of course, he asked me what I was doing, and I told him I was in broadcasting, and I had been invited over there. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm playing here tonight with my band." And he had one of the finest bands you have ever heard for the nightclub circuit. Really entertaining, and that was back in the days of kind of the jived up music, rock and roll, and that kind of music, and he was just terrific. I related that to Cash one time when I met him, and he said, "I cannot believe it." And I can't remember what I believe it's when he was with the Highwayman that I met him, and I told him about that. He said, "You got to be kidding. He'd never done anything." But it was quite funny, that incident there.
Well, it shows you never know, and you all didn't know really what was coming at that time. You were young men.
I will relate another story. My wife and I was walking down the street in Cape Girardeau, Missouri one time, and I kept hearing this voice saying, "Hey, Bill, hey, Bill." And I finally turned around and looked, and here was a fellow that came up, but he wasn't. He was a cryptologist, so he was the one who digested all the material that we took on Signal Corps typewriters, and we were intercepting all of the Morse code from what we call the Cold War countries, which was during the Cold War. Why, of course, if you were of that age, you would understand what was going on during that time. But we would intercept all of the military broadcasts out of the Cold War countries in Morse code, and we would copy it down. Now, to get back to this gentleman, he was the man who deciphered it all. He was the cryptologist behind the green door which us operators were never permitted to go behind the green door. So we did not know what was happening behind the green door. Now he is still alive, and he is now retired down in Texas, and I talk to Charlie quite often, mostly by email. Now then, I might say at this present time, there is only 2 of us living who was in room 85 originally, and that gentleman lives in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and to the best of my knowledge, he and I are the only 2 people alive who was actually the original occupants the day that we arrived in Landsberg.